We've got a really nice rainy day today, so a little bit less outdoor work, some more organizing and things like that. Taking it easy for the most part, and I thought it would be a nice opportunity, if the audio works for it, to take a look at some of the high tunnels in our system, since those are out of the rain, and how they're coming along this spring. So this will be a long form tour of the current status of a number of our high tunnels and season extension spaces, so stick around. I'm going to start by taking a look at the space in our backyard. This is our little cattle panel high tunnel, 7.5 feet wide by 16 feet long. And this is coming into, I believe this is its either 7th year or maybe 8th year. And it's a work in progress this year, some things that we need to refine and improve. But overall, the space is doing a whole bunch at the current moment. It's a little bit messy, but pretty functional. I just want to acknowledge first that the sound in this video might be a little bit funky from the raindrops on the plastic. I'm hoping it lands as just pleasant background sound and not too irritating, but we'll leave that alone and keep going forward. So lots happening in here. On this far end, this is the west end of this space, the southwest corner, we have an active compost heating pile. I've explored this concept a number of times. This year is not very different than other ones, so I didn't really explicitly document it, but there's a very simple metal ring. There's a whole bunch of bedding from our chicken yard, some very active compost, and filled it right up, put some charcoal on top and then some soil. And right now there are flats of tomatoes and peppers that, fingers crossed, are getting started in here. So they're getting some radiant warmth to get going. And on the far end, underneath the hay, is a planting of ginger. And the hope, we'll document as it evolves during the season, the hope is that without sprouting it in the house in advance, we can simply plant it into the compost that's on top of this bed of radiant warmth underneath the hay, which will trap in some of the heat, and they can sprout and start growing and be able to grow here for the whole season. We'll see how that all works out. Once this is sprouted and ready to go, these will be planted into another high tunnel, and we can sow the surface of this to a really nutrient-loving, warm, appreciating annual for the season to just grow in position. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. But right now that corner, which is hard to get to anyway, is doing a bunch of work. This pile of debris over here is, if we get a cold snap out of nowhere, we can put miscanthus sticks all around those seedlings and cover them for the evening just to keep some warmth in. There are a couple more flats in here that are all doing similar work of taking advantage of the early season warmth of this space to do some sprouting work. This is all sea kale. These are the same sorts of root fragments that we ship to folks, and this has been in here for a while. So these are, you can see how tiny the roots can be. It's a tiny little root fragment that has had some time to get some warmth and all this new growth. This is about ready to either be potted up or planted out to the field. We're waiting till the warmth of spring increases just a little bit, and then we'll move these wave by wave out to some nursery beds out in the landscape to grow. Here we've got some shipmast roots. These are rootlets left over from our spring shipping. It's nice to see that the ones that we didn't ship are actually really getting ready to grow. You can see new root growth down there and new callousing and top growth ready to go. So these will either plant out or share with some friends locally who are looking to grow some more shipmast. So yeah, some nursery work is going on in here. But then we also have these more naturalized areas. These are some mustards that overwintered, which we nibble at. And then one of our favorites for spring is this miner's lettuce, or Claytonia. These, we just let the seeds drop in on their own. We don't actually sow this anymore. They just grow when they're ready. You can see the ones in the back here are still really luscious and green. We'll be enjoying those. A fair bit of them, we're just letting them ripen some seed. They'll drop it, and then by the time those die back, which will be in the next few weeks, that might be a good opportunity to plant in some basils or hot peppers and just leave the dead or the senescing Claytonia as a ground cover to support the heat of the summer crop. They've actually become a really lovely late winter through early spring bonus of greens that take very, very little maintenance or work on our part. And then they just disappear when the heat of the summer comes and the high tunnel can switch functions. Thanks, Claytonia. You make life easy to have a good salad. On the far end, we've got our original planting of Miyoga ginger that is still here. We've been digging from here and transplanting out for a number of years, and yet any fragment we leave seems to just come up and expand. They're moving eastbound quite a bit. Even though we've been digging and digging all through here, I wouldn't mind moving most of them out of here, since we don't need to have this perennial ginger growing in a season extension space. I'd like to have this space for more dedicated for plants that actually really need it. But they're here and we appreciate them. They'll be a lovely deep green relatively soon. You can see stuck to the walls of this how tall they actually get. They go all the way up to here, they push right up against the plastic, and then we clean them up over the winter. And so we got to figure out what else can grow here. We're trialing Habilitia, a vining spinach, and maybe that can weave its way through the perennial ginger and use the ginger as a trellis so that we can get some greens out of this. But kind of sweet to see Myoga ginger just holding on very, very tenaciously and expanding continuously throughout this space, even though we're digging it up, even though there's lots of other plants growing. It's a really wonderful being. So this little space has been serving us really nicely for a bunch of years. If you're thinking about building something like a cattle panel Hightunnel, I really strongly encourage it. This is 4 cattle panels. You might be able to find them used where you live. The end walls you can see are very simply framed out. I've made some videos about how this was built way back when, and we really love this space and it's served us beautifully. Let's look at some other Hightunnels. Out on the other side of our property there, you can see the Hightunnel I was just looking at, and now we're over at our neighbor spot. And this is the 14 by 50 foot Hightunnel that we've documented pretty extensively, the installation of and some of the early experiments in growth. And this space is really doing a lot of pretty neat things at the moment. There's a whole lot to unpack in here. The first thing will be to take a look at this compost heating, just like in the Hightunnel in the backyard. This is a slightly larger one. I believe I made a video about, and if so, I'll link to it here. And we've got shipmass locust roots that are sprouting in the back. Let me see if I can zoom in. There's one in the corner. There's a bunch in there. There's some weeds and stuff. I bet there's a lot going on down below the soil surface. We just haven't messed with it much yet. This was an interesting experiment to see if we can get ginger to sprout without the bottom heat, without electric bottom heat, I should say. Well, I don't want to mess it up. You can see though that one's sprouting. There's a few more in here that are just beginning to sprout. And so that feels really promising. Whoops, that one fell out. Tuck that back in. So we'll allow these to sprout and start to green up in here a little bit, get the beginning of their growth established with the radiant heat from underneath, and then transplant them into this space. This is actually a space where we plan on doing a whole lot of ginger this year, and we've already started planting some from the crates that have sprouted earlier. In fact, everywhere that there's a miscanthus stalk that's standing up now has a ginger transplanted in. You can see one right here, one right here. So as we transplant out, so for example, right in here was perennial kales and different types of onions, and there were other brassicas in here, more onions. So as we dug them out and transplanted them into the garden and had these little gaps, we switched it over to ginger. They're on roughly 1 foot spacing, a little bit more here or there, and they're on the north side of this bed as a theme, with the idea that it holds the option of doing a hot pepper or an okra or maybe a tomato or some other climbing creature, cucumbers perhaps, that will climb up. We'll set up a trellis line through here. You can see where the rope is that comes down and supports the vining crop with the ginger to the north of them. Same thing on this side of the Hightunnel, ginger, 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 and then more fresh compost from the chicken yard that can be for tomatoes or other climbing crops. But in the short run, the warmth in here has been wonderful for the growth of salad greens for us. We've been enjoying lots and lots of really luscious salads out of here, mainly from Save Seed. You can see some kales in between that'll be starting to be for cooking soon enough, and there's a whole bunch of mustards. Those are so easy. In fact, they already got warm enough in here to start bolting, but that's fine. It's drawing the pollinators in, and until we need the space, we'll let this happen. If we don't need the space very intensely very soon, we'll just let these simply make flower and seed and then harvest the seed and swap them out for the next crop. So hopefully the timing will work for that. We're gonna have to figure out what to do with all this catnip. This volunteered in here a year or two ago. It grew so beautifully and so happily. I think it loves the heat and the dry that we can't, well, at some point we probably have to pull a bunch, move them elsewhere. We might move them to where our cats hang out in the garden more. But I think what Sasha wanted to do soon was to harvest a whole bunch of this really low. Maybe it's on a day when we're ready to transplant in a summer crop. But cut the catnip very low and then hang it in our chicken coop as a nice aromatic to keep it feeling fresh and pleasant in there. But my gosh, if we wanted to be a catnip farm, this would be the way to do it, is just let one head of catnip come in. In fact, I think I brought the catnip in way back when we had ashwagandha growing in here, and we were getting some beetles, some squash beetles that were thriving on them, and someone said rub some catnip on there, and I must have rubbed some that had seeds, and that's how we ended up with this whole catnip scene. So we'll work with them. We're not trying to eradicate them or control them, but we kind of don't want to lose the whole space to them, so we'll intervene a bit. It's sweet to see the figs are coming back from the ground. I would have loved to have seen the main stalks actually thrive over winter, but we just didn't have the windows buttoned up in here properly. And I think when we had -18 outside, it got, somewhere vaguely cold enough in that realm to knock back a lot of these figs. So lesson was learned. We're going to make sure it's really buttoned up in here. In other words, these windows on the far ends at the very top, they were open. So, bad decision on my end, and we lost a fair bit of figs from that. But we'll take the lesson. We'll make sure they're buttoned up for the winter. Maybe we'll do a fresh compost heating system. Maybe we'll put poly over these, in which case the figs should have a very easy time overwintering then. So a few years in, and we're finally getting enough information to act properly to make sure the figs are happy. On the far end here, we've got the perennial kale really booming. The bees are starting to really enjoy getting onto those, so we'll hopefully save some seed. This was a nice, very, very light blue, slate blue variety. Wonderful flavor, great color. A little bit of a propensity towards bolting, which isn't exactly ideal, but that's not a fair judgment of them, since if they were outside, would they have bolted? I don't know, but we'll collect seed and learn from them a little bit more. But that's its third year of growing here, and it's nice to know these are all edible and quite tasty. So we've got a beautiful, colorful garnish and something pleasant for the bees, and some options of getting seed from this cool plant too. It's raining a bunch outside here, so I'll dip out just for a moment and show way off in the distance, got the rainwater collection off the barn set up again. We'll take a look at that when it's not actively raining. But now that black line runs to here, and this hose is what we use for irrigation. So as of now, this entire tunnel can be irrigated passively with gravity-fed rainwater, which is pretty nice. And then that's from the top, but from the bottom, we've got a little swale. So the south side has a divot that's dug out that pitches in this direction. So all the rainwater that lands on the roof comes down, scoops under this little hole, and goes into here. So all that rainwater goes into this swale, and then through this deep layer of hay and wood chips, and it can equalize all the way to the far end. So when we get, almost 2 inches of rain today, which is a ridiculous amount, this would be a pretty gooey mess for a while, but then all that water can wick slowly into the beds. That design I've felt very, very good about. It's a really nice passive way of adding a huge amount of additional water deep down in the beds, and then when we water with rainwater from above, with very rich soil, very, very high density plantings, and a lot of mulch, the space can maintain the moisture it needs without a huge amount of input from us or effort or stress. There's so much more I could talk about in this space, but I need to go back and check on the fire, make sure things are going along in a good way. It's funny to be at the end of April and still using the wood stove a little bit, but on these super rainy days, it's nice to be warm and cozy inside. But yeah, the space is filling out nicely. The ginger project is well underway. We'll keep sharing notes on how that unfolds and evolves. And as the space gets filled out a little bit more, and especially when the vining layer comes in, I'll be really excited to share all that. Out here in our chicken yard, this is in the front yard, lots of structures. That's our winter run. This is where I planted ginger on the west side. We got a lot of ginger underway. We'll have to see. We can take a look at that in a moment. But I thought it'd be interesting to see kind of a very different pace or a different look of things. This is a similar sized high tunnel to the one in our backyard that we've realized over time has been extremely valuable as a dust bathing space for our chickens. So it's a straight up moonscape in here at the moment. With all the rain, the water's starting to wick through. They've kicked through tons of soil, so this will become mud and then really, really high nutrient wet compost. I need to dig this out so it's better drained. I think figure out some portion of this. Maybe it's not this whole space, but like, okay, ladies, come on in, and here's your dust bathing space, but that the rest of it is available for actually growing crops. The hens are small enough and they can take turns, but just thought this would be an interesting juxtaposition to the high tunnel in our neighbor's yard. Animals without any real thoughtful design about how they're interacting with a space can seem pretty destructive. We've let it happen because we've got enough other growing space, and they derive a huge amount of pleasure and good therapy from access to dry soil. But there's some better design direction that integrates more green and more life in this space. So we'll leave this as it is, but I thought I'd show it anyway. They're waiting for me to get out of the way so they can go in on this rainy day and enjoy a nice dry hot dust bath. Go ahead, ladies. So the last space to check out is this high tunnel right by the road, another cattle panel. Clearly a technique of building season extension space that I appreciate. Just kind of keep replicating them. And this one has been doing some neat things. Be our last stop on the tour here. More again of the ginger. These we are trialing in this space just open. They're sprouting pretty nicely, maybe a little slower than they could, but they're doing their thing. We've got more ship masts and more roots that are being developed with the heat that's in here. This is our gumi save seed from last year. It's really promising how many little ones are coming up. This is from some really nice cultivar plants. We sowed the seed fresh. That seems to be a lesson learned with gumi, is collect the seed fresh out of the fruit and sow it immediately into a bed. So we'll keep our eyes on these and transplant them out sooner than later. That's what's happening on this side of the space. And that's fine enough, but it's not all that productive and not all that beautiful. Over here is the showstopper. This is kales and mustards that we've been cultivating by getting out of the way. In other words, I go through and I'll rogue out, I'll harvest for the chickens stray mustards that have a weird fuzziness or are bolting early or aren't really exactly what we're hoping for. Maybe this little group in here will come out. And then where we see interesting looking kales, we eat the ones that we don't really necessarily love the look of, although in here now it's looking very good. And we let the other ones grow. But this has all been from kales that have been curated just a little bit. You can see this year's growth from last year. They'll flower, they'll make seed, they'll drop the seed into here, and then it'll come up sometime in the winter. We didn't sow any of this seed. We've just removed the seedlings we didn't want. And so it's a no-till, in some ways, no plant. It's just basically removal of the little bit that we don't want. But I only do a little bit at a time so that we can bring really beautiful fresh greens to the hens. They love this kind of stuff, freshly picked brassica. So this space is working really nicely. It's a little bit of a selection bank, a little place to grow seed, a lot of food for us and food for the hens with the weeds. So that's worked nicely, and we barely water that. It's deep, it's well covered, and that seems to take care of itself. This is our last compost heating bin of the tour. This one is suspended. You can see how strong pallets actually are. It's actually black locust runs, split rail runs that are underneath that. The idea with this is so we can have a little pond to pull water from. So when it rains a bunch, this will fill up. So that should be full by the end of the day. And then this space was filled with compost from the chicken yard and used to help sprout some ginger, and we'll grow some summer crops. You can see the squash that showed up. That's a testament to how warm and nutrient loaded it is, because we've had some very much below freezing nights, and this is right next to a window. So So this has stayed warm enough to be happy for the last month, and all the greens on the side are telling me it's still moist enough to grow some things. So we've got to think about what's next. I'm thinking a whole bunch of varieties of basil, just ridiculous deep green plumes of basil, and then let these greens grow on the side. But the basic idea of incorporating a compost heating system in a Hightunnel has been wonderful to us. And yeah, I think that's my tour for this time. I'm gonna get back to the fire, get things organized, get off the busy road, feed the hens these greens. Let me know what sort of questions you have. We'll do an update that's outside and far away from the road next, I promise.